A 40-man patrol assembled at the 5th Marine Division headquarters for their last briefing with Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colbert Chandler Johnson on the morning of February 23, 1945, on the little Pacific island of Iwo Jima. The Marines were given a risky task: scale Mit Suribachi, which was 554 feet high, secure the peak, and raise an American flag once the job was accomplished. The Leathernecks had been engaged in combat with a fervent Japanese army for the last 4 days in an attempt to capture the crucial peak. One could see the entire island from its summit. The key area had to be taken fast to keep the Germans from firing down on the infantry that was moving north to take the rest of Iwo Jima. Staff Sergeant Louis R. Lowry, a photographer for Leatherneck magazine, was one of the group that day. Lowry took photos to chronicle the climb as the men started their journey. When the Marines arrived at the summit, they scattered and promptly took control of the area. After snapping a photo of the flag being raised, Lowry made the decision to descend the mountain again. He ran into Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal on his way down. "I already took a picture of the flag raising," Lowry said. Rosenthal considered going back down the mountain, but changed his mind. He reasoned that from the summit of Suribachi there would be fantastic views of the island. He ascended further. Upon arriving at the crest, Rosenthal noticed that the Marines intended to raise a larger flag for better visibility by everyone on the island and offshore. Rosenthal took a brief picture as the 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman fought to hoist the drainage pipe with the American flag tied to it. He had just captured the greatest battle photograph ever, but he was unaware of it at the time. With the caption, "The raising of the flag on Iwo Jima," Rosenthal's shot instantly became a symbol of World War II when it appeared in the March 26, 1945 issue of Life magazine. It was featured on 3.5 million posters, a postage stamp, and in war bond drives. It later served as the model for Arlington National Cemetery's 100-ton bronze monument honoring dead Marines. Ironically, Rosenthal was initially unsure which of the 4 pictures he took on Mount Suribachi that morning would be picked up by the wire service. A total of 4 pictures of the flag raising and a number of Marines gathered around it once it was in the air had been captured by him. After his film was returned to Guam for processing, Rosenthal didn't realize he had shot a notable picture until 2 days later, when he got a congratulatory wire from his editors. The renowned picture was so memorable that there were accusations it was staged. According to Rosenthal, figuring out a composition like that wouldn't have been any disgrace at all. However, I just didn't. I was lucky to have the breeze rippling the flag to my right, the soldiers in good positions, and a clear day that allowed me to see everything clearly. To bring all into clear focus. From its beginnings in the middle of the 19th century to the present, Rosenthal provided a decent functioning account of war photography in his own humble style. When all of those factors come together, as they did for Rosenthal at Iwo Jima, the result is a photograph that simultaneously captures the stark reality of the moment, while also achieving a mysterious alchemy that elevates the image to a work of art and, occasionally, to a symbol for an entire war. Photographers who follow men at war must rely on their instincts, their technical skill, and a good deal of luck to bring everything into sharp focus. Photographs have been used extensively to portray the harsh reality of war, almost since their invention. People in the U.S. and other countries have been made aware of the atrocities of the battlefield by the images of death and devastation captured by daring combat photographers like Joe Rosenthal. Occasionally, certain images have even influenced public opinion in favor of or against a specific battle. Such photographers have therefore accomplished what the late author and philosopher Susan Sontag referred to as the heroism of vision. Early photographs of the war. Joseph Nicephore Niepce, a Frenchman, took the first photograph in 1827. He employed a substance that, when exposed to light, would solidify. This process may take up to 8 hours. After working together for a few years, Niepce and Louis Daguerre started experimenting with methods to speed up the development process. Daguerre carried on with his experiments after Niepce's death in 1833. He eventually managed to cut the exposure duration from 8 hours to 30 minutes in 1839. The new method produced what became known as a daguerreotype, an image etched on a copper plate. The earliest photographers, armed with Daguerre's improved innovation, set out to capture the spirit of everyday life. The result was formal, static images of individuals sitting in their best Sunday attire in front of a gadget that poet Oliver Wendell Holmes evocatively referred to as the mirror with a memory. Their subjects were ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, both literally and symbolically. Photographers naturally started going outside to take more authentic shots. Unfortunately, fighting is one of the most natural human undertakings, and photographers jumped on the bandwagon with the same fervor that painters had in the past. Between 1846 and 1848, during the Mexican War, the first daguerreotypes of war were captured. A regiment of American cavalry riding down a Mexican street is the only one that displays real activity rather than staged images of illustrious leaders and unimportant soldiers. Another, taken at Exeter, NH, depicts a group of New Hampshire volunteers, apparently on their way to the distant battlefield, following their company band with their swords drawn. Another depicts a Mexican child encircling an American soldier on Saltillo's streets. The first conflict to be photographed, the Crimean War. 10 years later, during the Crimean War, a concerted attempt was undertaken to capture real-life warfare experiences on camera. A series of prints of the bulwarks enclosing Wingo Sound in the Baltic Sea were taken by amateur photographer Gilbert Elliott. It is unknown where the originals are now. Richard Nicklin, another photographer, also captured a lot of pictures. Unfortunately, on November 14, 1854, a hurricane tore through Balaclava Harbor, causing Nicklin's boat to sink, losing his images, equipment, assistants, and himself at sea. Soon, a lot of people started to voice their opposition to the needless and expensive war. The way the conflict was being handled was sharply condemned by correspondents like William Howard Russell of the London Times. The British people were enraged and sympathetic after reading Russell's accounts of the terrible conditions the soldiers faced in Balaclava. At that point, Thomas Agnew of Thomas Agnew and Sons Publishing presented the British government with a proposal. In order to disprove Russell and other reporters' criticism of the war, he volunteered to send someone to the Crimea. He would back up his arguments with pictures. Agnew dispatched Roger Fenton to take wartime photos in the Crimea in 1855. Fenton, a portrait photographer and unsuccessful painter who had frequently taken images of the royal family, avoided photographing any scenes that would offend the people. Equipped with a letter of introduction from Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, Fenton freely roamed the camps, focusing on images of disciplined military design and discipline, and steering clear of anything that would paint the war in a negative light. There were oddly few images of genuine filth, death, and illness in Fenton's 360-degree panorama, which mostly featured happy, well-dressed officers dining, drinking, and smoking in the camp. Fenton was able to lie both by commission and by omission. His most well-known image, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, depicted what was allegedly the location of the British cavalry's renowned, if misguided, charge of the Light Brigade. According to recent studies, the location, a valley dotted with pebbles and spent cannonballs, was formerly an innocuous gully close to Sevastopol. Ironically, Fenton did discover the actual location of the charge and vivid proof of the genuine nature of the battle. The photographer reported his discoveries in a letter home. "We found a lot of skeletons that were partially buried, with enough flesh remaining in the muscles to keep it from falling from the shoulders. One was lying as though he had raised himself up on his elbow. There were shoes on the feet, a flesh gun, and another man's wrists and feet off the ground. Fenton didn't even bother to unpack his camera. Such things were unnecessary for the domestic public, and the Queen and Prince might not have approved." The atrocities of war return home. Despite the fact that the Crimean War damaged British perceptions of war generally, photographers continued to cover wars in the future. Another chance to depict the realities of war presented itself a year after the conflict ended, and this time, someone was up to the task. The East India Company's indigenous sepoy soldiers rebelled against their British overlords in 1857. The insurrection began for a variety of reasons, including the Indian soldiers' dissatisfaction with their deployment to Burma, their low pay, and their service with soldiers from other castes. The introduction of the Enfield pattern 1853 rifle was the last straw that sparked the rebellion, in order to manually load the weapons. 77 caliber cartridge. The powder and mini-A ball had to be poured down the barrel by chewing off the end of the paper cartridge. There were false and widespread rumors that the cartridges were lubricated with beef tallow and pig fat, which are prohibited by both Muslim and Hindu law. To defuse the crisis, the British government substituted vegetable oil and beeswax for the beef and pig, and replaced the allegedly contaminated rounds. But the sepoys continued to hear rumors that the rounds were still tainted. A brutal struggle that lasted more than a year ensued after British Commander-in-Chief General George Anson brashly said, "I'll never give in to their beastly prejudices." Both sides carried out horrendous atrocities, and the conflict claimed the lives of hundreds of defenseless bystanders. Felice Beato, an Italian, was among the first photographers on the scene. According to some theories, Beato and Fenton were both hired by the British government to capture comforting pictures of the mutiny for the domestic audience. With a big box camera that used 10 by 12-inch plates, Beato was free to move about the different conflict zones in India, whether or not that was the case. Beato captured more than 60 pictures in and around the besieged city of Lucknow in the spring of 1858, shortly after Sir Colin Campbell's rescue force had liberated it. The inside of the Secundrabad Palace near Lucknow, where British troops had executed some 2,000 mutineers, is seen in Beato's most well-known image. The first images of human remains on a battlefield, captured on camera, are the skeletal bones in the foreground. The bone remains are thought to have been moved by Beato for dramatic effect. The great pile of bodies had been decently covered over before the photographer could take them, but he insisted on having them uncovered to be photographed before they were finally disposed of, according to Sir George Campbell's memoirs. A population that had never witnessed such atrocities before was outraged by the Secundrabad photograph, which Beato composed, as well as another that showed the hanging bodies of 2 sepoys who had been executed. Beato kept taking pictures of dead soldiers' remains, but he never took pictures of dead British or Allied forces. He visited China in 1860, when the British and French were engaged in the Second Opium War with the Chinese. When Beato arrived on the battlefield following the Chinese loss at Taku Fort, he was thrilled to see the bodies of mangled Chinese soldiers gathered around an exploded magazine. It was the first shot of real dead bodies taken right after a combat, and Beato reportedly started racing around with great excitement, begging people not to disturb the bodies until perpetuated by his photographic apparatus. Even though Beato's extensive body of work exclusively included the dead of the enemy, it represents the first time a photographer has truly attempted to depict the atrocities of war. Eventually, this would be referred to as photojournalism. The Civil War in America. The new photographic method became much more fascinating as the American Civil War broke out. Both North and South soldiers hurried to have their photos made with their handguns and sidearms for their loved ones back home. Soon, the groaning wagon of the traveling photographer, filled with his heavy gear, was a familiar sight in military campgrounds. After having his photo taken, Private Friend H. Smith of Company B, 20th Connecticut Volunteers, who was a happy customer, wrote to his wife, "I was over this afternoon and had my likeness taken. I was number 17 when I arrived early, and I received one about noon. Yesterday he took 73. He's making quick cash. $1 per piece was the price. I'll send mine to you in this letter, and I hope it arrives undamaged. As you can see, I nearly destroyed it by placing a piece of soft paper on it. You can purchase a case or frame and place my photo inside. Because it lacks a casing, take care not to scratch it." In addition to these comfortable, well-known images, the Civil War photographers documented previously unseen graphic views of death and devastation on the conflict's many battlefields. The most well-known photographer was Mathew Brady, who, with permission from President Abraham Lincoln, hired a team of photographers to visit the many camps and battlegrounds and take pictures of the conflict from the Union side. Brady's team received more than 7,000 negatives overall. These gifted guys, like Timothy O'Sullivan, John Rookie, and Alexander Gardner, produced hundreds of images that showed the atrocities that resulted from the collision of outdated methods with contemporary technology. O'Sullivan captured the mangled and lifeless corpses of fallen Union soldiers at Gettysburg in 1863 in one such image. He gave it the all-too-fitting title of Harvest of Death. The scene of the injured awaiting medical attention following the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863 was also gruesome. One man is on a stretcher after having his left foot amputated, while another is sitting with his left forearm missing. For the first time, the American people were being shown the horrifying results of the fratricidal conflict. Brady's picture gallery in New York City had an exhibition titled The Dead of Antietam in October 1862. Alexander Gardner, Brady's talented aide, had snapped the pictures. Broadway browsers were not warned that they were about to witness something horrifying, the first images of American soldiers who had died. Despite the headline being blatantly correct, the spectators were stunned into silence by the haphazardly scattered remains of Confederates who had either been buried close to Dunker Church or along the sunken road. According to a New York Times reviewer, Mr. Brady has done his part to make us realize how serious and awful war is. He has done something quite similar if he hasn't brought bodies and placed them on our streets and dooryards. Future Supreme Court Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., was a poet who had hurried to Antietam to help his wounded namesake. He later wrote in Atlantic Monthly about the influence the photos had on him, saying, "Let him who wishes to know what war is, look at this series of illustrations. Only yesterday were these remains of manhood arranged in gruesome rows for burial, or tossed together in reckless heaps. A lot of people wouldn't read this series. Many would lock it up after seeing it and dreaming of its horrors. It was almost like going to the battleground. This merging of two hysterical crowds, which we refer to as armies, gives us a vague idea of how disgusting, vicious, nauseating, and terrible this monster is. Images from the Civil War have become ingrained in the American consciousness, making it the most photographed conflict in history. The finest generals, including Ulysses S. The fundamental meaning of the conflict in all its inherent, homegrown grandeur is reflected in the common troops, even while figures like Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson continue to stare at us through the decades. The Civil War troops, whether alive or dead, lying obscenely shattered on a battlefield that was someone's farm the day before, or smiling for the camera in their war attire, hold a special place in the American consciousness. Pictures are given by you. I'm going to furnish war. During the Spanish-American War of 1898, the country's next major conflict, photography had a significant impact on Americans. In order to chronicle the escalating rebellion against Spain, which he firmly believed the United States should get engaged in, renowned newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst dispatched battalions of reporters to Cuba. The American public was moved by newspaper illustrations and stories of alleged and actual crimes against Cuban peasants, even though a large portion of the material was blatantly untrue. Hearst dispatched renowned illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba, but he was unimpressed by the ostensibly revolutionary atmosphere there, and thought the island was peaceful. "There is no trouble here," he allegedly wired Hearst. "War won't break out. I want to go back." Hearst retorted, "Please stay. You provide images." Whether or not the exchange actually happened, it aptly captures the press's role in inciting and supporting the totally needless conflict. I will furnish war. Hearst's goal was fulfilled in 1898 when the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor under unexplained circumstances. The United States was once again at war, and journalists and photographers would be covering it extensively. Theodore Roosevelt, who rose to the rank of colonel in the renowned volunteer regiment known as the Rough Riders and, with the aid of a convenient assassin, rode his fame all the way into the White House, was among the many officers and military leaders who seized the chance to have themselves photographed during this time. Spanish-American war photographers encountered several challenges when covering the conflict, as they were greatly outnumbered by their print counterparts. Their camera sizes, which ranged from 12 by 20 inches to 5 by 7 inches, were a persistent issue. As the fight necessitated constant movement across a humid, jungle-like region, most cameramen agreed with Collier's photographer Jimmy Hare that the smaller the camera, the better. The absence of portable darkrooms was particularly noticeable. Hearst anticipated this need and gave his photographers access to an offshore boat. The photographic technique was additionally hampered by the intense tropical light, thick foliage, and frequent rain. The majority of photographers deliberately made the decision to follow conventional norms of conduct throughout the Spanish-American War, which was arguably the final gentleman's war. The photographers mostly avoided taking pictures of dead American bodies, even though the military did not have any formal control. The body of Rough Rider Hamilton Fish Jr., who was murdered in an ambush near Las Guasimas, was not discovered by Burr McIntosh of Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. While Theodore Roosevelt and other regimental officers were less than 15 feet away, joking and eating lunch without noticing the dead men, he did take a photograph of Fish's and a private named Stevens's canvas-shrouded corpses laid out next to each other. The photograph was not published by Collier's, which could have seriously harmed Roosevelt's future political career, but a second shot of the two bodies alone, with Fish's hobnailed boots sticking out from the end of the blanket, became one of the most acclaimed images of the war. The first war to be filmed. During the Spanish-American War, events were first documented using moving pictures, a relatively new technology in addition to photography. The Edison Manufacturing Company, which was controlled by the famous inventor Thomas Alva Edison, and the Biograph Company were among the nascent motion picture businesses that came to Tampa, Florida, to record the war. The cinema firms hoped to take advantage of the public's desire for war news, just like Hearst and his publishing adversary Joseph Pulitzer did, by using sensational journalism to boost newspaper circulation. The New York Journal, a Hearst newspaper, engaged cameraman William Paley, who was employed by Edison, to document the conflict. While in Tampa, he observed the activities of camp life, including the drills and maneuvers that accompanied the monotony of stateside assignment. After that, he went to Key West to record the military funeral for the main tragedy victims. He then traveled to Cuba in order to seize the wounded battleship's wreckage that was still adrift in Havana Harbor. He also took pictures of Cubans, known as reconcentrados, who had left their homeland after the Spaniards imprisoned them in concentration camps. Paley was present to record the American forces' exit from Florida as they started to leave. Another filmmaker who traveled to Cuba for the Biograph Company during the war was Johann Wilhelm Billy Bitzer. He captured on camera the aftermath of the Spanish defeat at Santiago Harbor in July, as well as the evacuation of injured American soldiers in boats after the combat of Las Guasimas. Unfortunately, after a short time in the combat zone, Bitzer and Paley both contracted a fever and had to return to the United States. The actual fights were not documented because of the cumbersome and ungainly equipment that the photographers and filmmakers had to carry. Edison instead decided to record reenactments of these incidents at his studio in the New Jersey wilderness. He filmed multiple fighting scenes with National Guard members. Among his most well-known was U.S. A romanticized account of the conflict is infantry supported by Rough Riders at El Caney. Images of the occupation. The Spanish-American War ended as swiftly as it had begun. However, one unintended consequence was that Spain sold the Philippines to the United States. Soon after, a native-born uprising engulfed the country in yet another conflict. The U.S. military engaged in a brutal and progressively unpopular war with Filipino rebels from 1899 to 1902. Once more, photographers attempted to capture the essence of the rugged environment of the archipelago and the daily lives of soldiers. Among these photos was one of the 28th U.S. In 1901, volunteer infantry destroyed Fort Sea Ray on Mindanao. Another depicted a more humorous aspect of the battle, showing a young squad of cavalry soldiers posing with a water buffalo and one of their fellows sitting on top of it. Another showed the violence of the Moros, the rebels' name, when the camera captured two of the rebels brandishing crises, or sharp-edged knives. First World War and censorship. But the Philippine War would soon be eclipsed by events in Europe. The Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, on June 28, 1914, traveling in a motorcade. The pair went there to commemorate their 14th wedding anniversary and St. Vitus Day, a national holiday in the Balkans. In 1914, nationalistic intrigue was rife in the Balkans. The southern region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was home to Bosnian Serbs who desired to join Serbia. Austria did not want to give up any portion of its monarchy after formally annexing the area in 1908. A bomb was thrown at the Archduke's car on that fateful day. He deflected it immediately, but his wife was hit in the face by a stray piece of shrapnel, and the explosion that followed injured other people in another car. 19-year-old Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip, who was waiting when their car made an untimely wrong turn, shot and killed Ferdinand and his wife when he insisted on visiting the injured parties at the hospital. Although there are no photographs of the actual shooting, one depicts Princip being pinned down by police right after the incident. Princip's action sparked World War I, 4 years of brutal fighting, and the atrocities were mercilessly captured on camera for future generations. The war was significantly impacted by censorship. In order to prevent the people from learning the truth about what was actually happening on the battlefields, British correspondents were instructed to write only uplifting and good articles. "I am not allowed to put dead men into my pictures because apparently they do not exist," one artist said sourly. Except for the official photographers, everyone found in possession of a camera would be shot. Despite being a press photographer before the war, Private F.A. Fry concealed one under his uniform and captured the dawn attack at Loos in 1915. The photographers were able to capture some of the pain, devastation, and bravery of an especially pointless and expensive war, in spite of the restrictions. Many of the images were unavoidably of trench life in all its vile, heart-stopping detail, because the majority of the combat took place in and near the extensive network of trenches that crisscrossed Western Europe. Men with mud-splattered, wet, and disheveled faces gazed at the camera with tired, empty eyes. A queue of gassed British soldiers making their way to an aid station was seen in one very moving image. "We'd only gone 100 yards in front of the Canadians when we encountered gas," said Sergeant Jack Dorgan of the Northumberland Fusiliers, who was gassed in April 1915, describing the terrible spectacle. "We had never heard of the gas industry and had not received any instruction on gas prevention. All we had in the first aid box we carried in our tunic was a roll of bandages, and our eyes were gushing with anguish and water. As a result, we bandaged each other's eyes, and whoever could see would lead a line of around 6 men, each placing a hand on the man in front of them. In this manner, British men marched back towards Ypres in long lines, with rolls of bandages covering their eyes." Jimmy Hare of Leslie's Weekly was able to capture a graphic image of a dead German soldier whose body had been doused with lime disinfectant to stop the spread of disease. But due to censorship, not a single photograph of American casualties was published during World War I. When Lucian Kirtland, another Leslie journalist, traveled to the Lorraine front in May 1918, he shot the most gruesome photograph to be published in a major American publication during the war. An abandoned trench was covered in a rotting collection of German skulls and skeletons in Kirtland's shot, "War's Skulls and Crossbones." As stated in the caption, "Death evens all scores." The development of color photography. The introduction of color during World War I was a significant advancement in photography. A color photography process was patented in 1907 by two brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumière, who were pioneers in the French film industry. The majority of the color photos taken during the conflict were taken by the French troops. Most of these images featured local people, bombed-out buildings, landscapes, and soldiers. Public viewing was prohibited for images showing the atrocities of trench warfare and the foolish attacks on defended positions that resulted in thousands of deaths. They weren't made public till years later. The British historian Arthur Ponsonby would later write, with some justification, "There was no more discreditable period in the history of journalism than the 4 years of the Great War." The great majority of the iconic images of death and destruction during the war that still ring in the mind's eye were only released after the war, too late to affect public opinion during perhaps the most unnecessary war of the 20th century. During the Spanish Civil War, war was usually at the top of photographers' lists when they traveled the world in the years leading up to World War II, looking for dramatic events to capture. One such person was Robert Capa, Ernest Friedman. Capa was born in Budapest, Hungary, in 1913. He changed his name to Robert Capa since it sounded more American than his real Hungarian name and was similar to the name of the movie director Frank Capra. Capa was reporting the Spanish Civil War when, on the afternoon of September 5, 1936, he happened to be with a group of loyalist militiamen near the village of Vichero Muriano, 8 miles north of Córdoba. Capa was crouching in a ravine behind the guys in the growing darkness on a distant hillside when fascist rebels suddenly began fire with a machine gun. Perhaps the most famous and contentious war shot in history was taken by the photographer who instinctively snapped his camera. It depicts, or claims to depict, a soldier sliding backwards as he dies. The photograph's veracity is still up for question nearly 70 years later. First published on September 23, 1936, in the French magazine Vuon, Capa's photograph, Loyalist Militiaman at the Moment of Death, was then featured in Life magazine's July 12, 1937 issue. Capa, a prominent liberal, has been accused by some of staging the image for propaganda. However, recent research appears to confirm the validity of the shot. However, it is not totally definitive. Based on the soldier's unique cartridge case, researchers have determined that he is Federico Borrell Garcia, a 24-year-old Alcoy mill worker who joined the local militia to support the democratically elected government. It seems that Borrell had scaled the gully that afternoon, perhaps to have a better look at the action or to pose for Capa. Capa never mentioned the incident afterwards, which supports the idea that Borrell was posing for the camera when he was shot and killed. In any event, Borrell was the only employee of the company to be reported killed at Vichero Muriano that day, and his younger brother subsequently attested to the fact that the man in Capa's well-known photo was actually his brother. Capa's working mantra, "If your pictures are no good, you aren't close enough," was aptly exemplified by the photograph, which has come to be known as Falling Soldier. Second World War. Photographs, signs of survivability. The United States entered yet another international war on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Photographers and video crews, both military and civilian, would quickly accompany any branch of the military into combat. To prevent the public from seeing the horrifying pictures of battle, the government initially enforced censorship, but President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a change of heart after seeing the image of 3 dead American soldiers lying in the sand on Buna Beach, New Guinea, taken by life photographer George Strock. The obscene image, titled "Here Lie 3 Americans," appeared in the September 20th, 1943 issue of the magazine. If Bill had the courage to take it, then we ought to have the courage to look at it. Life editorialized identified the middle soldier as Bill, the Wisconsin boy. Later, newsreel images of dead Marines washing ashore at Tarawa in November 1943 was screened in theaters nationwide. Most Americans had never witnessed the gruesome aftermath of a fight, so they were shocked. Roosevelt's choice had some positive effects, such as a sharp rise in war bond sales, but enlistment fell by 35%. For Life magazine, Robert Capa landed on Omaha Beach with the first wave of infantry when the Allies invaded France on June 6, 1944. Capa tried to insert more film after running out of it, so he could shoot more pictures, but his hands were shaking so much that he was unable to reload the camera. He would thereafter describe it as a new kind of fear shaking my body from toe to hair. Ironically, most of the pictures were accidentally destroyed when a young Larry Burroughs, who would go on to become one of the top photographers during the Vietnam War, left them in the drying cabinet for too long and caused them to overheat. A cutout of the whole event, Capa said of the ones that survived, depicting American infantrymen wading ashore and seeking shelter from the deadly German artillery and automatic weapons fire. The most well-known image, Crawling Through the Water, which was hazy and blurry, featured a lone, grim American walking straight into the German gunfire. His grim and determined face perfectly encapsulated the D-Day landing and, in fact, the entire American war experience, a filthy task that must be endured and survived, but not exalted. Following Capa's example, World War II photographers focused on people, in part because the mind could not take in the whole. According to author Susan Muller, one had to cling to something trivial, commonplace, and understandable because the horror, the sound of the bombs, and the sheer number of deaths were so overwhelming. Journalists like Ernie Pyle, Bill Malden, and Richard Tregaskis carried on this limited focus in print. But, as is frequently the case, a single photograph might better convey the war's entire significance. The individual soldier and his fight for survival became the icon of the conflict. Once more, Capa succeeded in doing so with his photograph, Last Man to Die, taken in May 1945. It depicts a young American machine gunner who was shot dead by a German sniper while firing from a building's balcony in Leipzig, Germany. The caption for Life magazine said, "Blood begins to flow from the soldier's forehead, forming pool on floor. He passed away instantly." Documenting Korea's Cold War. It was difficult to predict that the United States and many other countries would be involved in another fight, this time on the Korean Peninsula, within 5 years of the end of World War II. More than 9,000 North Korean soldiers invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, after flooding across the 38th parallel. In order to stop the communist advance, the UN sent soldiers and supplies to the struggling nation. Photographers and journalists soon followed. One of the most well-known photographers who covered the Korean War was David Douglas Duncan of Life magazine. His images' quality, artistry, and impact astounded his contemporaries and editors. In one such image, a Marine corporal soaked in mud was seen jumping over the corpse of a deceased North Korean soldier while he was navigating a ditch while dodging hostile machine gun fire. During the battle for the Pusan perimeter in September 1950, Duncan captured it. 2 months later, a second photograph captured a tired Marine slogging through a frozen tin of beans to make his meal. In response to Duncan's question about his Christmas wishes, the Marine merely said, "Give me tomorrow," and resumed his bean chopping. The Commander-in-Chief of Korea, General Douglas MacArthur, made a daring decision while the 8th Army was strongly engaged. At the port of Incheon, which is notorious for its hazardous tides and seawalls, he would land components of the 1st Marine Division. His staff begged him to pick a different landing location, but MacArthur refused. From September 15, 1950, the attack began. On that day, 1st Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez of Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, was photographed by a combat photographer as he scaled the seawall. It became into one of the war's most iconic images. Later, Lopez would sacrifice himself on a grenade to save his men's lives. He would receive a posthumous Medal of Honor. The controlled flight from the Shozan Reservoir was joined by Allied soldiers in November of that year. The country was stunned by images and videos of retreating Marines and soldiers enduring the bitterly cold Korean winter with below-freezing temperatures. The camera would follow the various units as they engaged in a stalemate with the Chinese Army and the Koreans over the course of the following 3 years. Ultimately, an armistice that put a stop to hostilities was signed on July 27, 1953. They are only partially accurate. The United States' involvement in aiding the South Vietnamese government grew throughout the 10 years after the Korean War ended. North and South Vietnam were separated along the 17th parallel following the Communists' 1954 victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu. By the late 1950s, North Vietnam had started supplying its forces based there, as well as in neighboring Laos and Cambodia, with troops and supplies via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was named after the communist commander. Over the following 10 years, the American presence increased gradually but unavoidably. President Lyndon Johnson dispatched additional American soldiers as the violence increased, and by 1965, the U.S. was embroiled in yet another land conflict in Southeast Asia. America's most contentious conflict would be Vietnam. For many people, it is still an emotional problem today. Additionally, it would be the first time combat footage was shown on television, making it unique. The American public first saw the vivid photographs thanks to photographers like Tim Page, Larry Burroughs, Dickie Chappelle, Eddie Adams, and Henry Hewitt. It was America's first living room war, and the horrific battle was broadcast on the evening news every night. One of the first photographers on the ground in Vietnam, Robert Capa, was killed in 1954 after walking on a landmine and refused to document the American presence. The conflict's turning point was the Tet Offensive in 1968. images of dead Viet Cong soldiers on American soil, the summary execution of a Viet Cong prisoner by the Saigon Embassy and Saigon Chief of Police Nguyen Ngoc Lone sparked anti-war sentiment. The iconic image of Lone shooting the prisoner was captured by Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams. For his photograph, he would win the prestigious World Press Photo Award and the Pulitzer Prize. But Adams was not wholly satisfied with the result. In actuality, Lone had learned that Viet Cong militants had murdered his friend's entire family. Adams claimed in Time magazine, "I killed the general with my camera, and the general killed the Viet Cong." Photographs continue to be the world's most potent weapon. Photographs do lie, even when they are not altered, but people still trust them. They are just partially accurate. The way that the Vietnam War photos are perceived frequently determines their impact. For instance, Nick Ute of the Associated Press captured a now famous image in the spring of 1972 during the communist Easter onslaught in South Vietnam. It depicts Kim Phuc, a nude Vietnamese girl, running down Highway 1. The napalm dropped from airplanes had burned her garments off her body. The episode was swiftly seized by the anti-war movement to denounce the careless deployment of American weapons against defenseless villagers. In actuality, a South Vietnamese A-1E Sky Raider had dropped the napalm, and some of the jellied material had accidentally hit a group of bystanders. At the time, there were no American planes in the region. The American public finally lost interest in the war after seeing pictures of wounded and dead Marines being flown on an M48 tank from the Battle of Hue City in February 1968, the siege of the Marine base at Khe Sanh, the weekly death toll, and the flag-draped coffins returning to the nation every day. The conflict came to an official end in January 1973, when a peace deal was signed in Paris. But a little more than 2 years later, the Communists would go on the offensive once more in an attempt to bring the nation together. South Vietnamese civilians frantically attempting to scale the fence into the safety of the embassy compound, pushing South Vietnamese helicopters off the side of American aircraft carriers, and the iconic images of the helicopters departing the embassy's roof served as a painful reminder of the Vietnam experience. The event would have been meaningless without the camera. The camera will continue to follow the action when battles break out in the 21st century, bringing its unforgettable sights to an audience that is either excited or horrified. Photojournalists will be on the front lines of the action, risking death and severe injury to document the events for future generations. But even they are unable to ignore the pain of others around them. While sifting through thousands of photos from various wars and conflicts, renowned photojournalist Donald McCullen came across this information. He came to the realization, it was like all quiet on the Western Front, men moving through the fog in a march, when author Philip Knightley wrote, "Without the presence of the camera, the event would have meant nothing." He encapsulated the contributions of combat photographers and their position as vicarious witnesses for the rest of the world. Men I'd seen killed came up out of the mist of war to join me,